honored that Jim took up the challenge to take this journey for the people of Gaza, to challenge the blockade and to challenge the really ridiculous position of the federal government on this issue when all governments should be challenging the illegal blockade. And I'll leave it to Jim to say a few words about his thoughts on what happened.
Well, first of all, it was an honor to be able to represent the Canadian movement on the Estelle. The Estelle is an international movement. It's a sailing ship from Finland, but the movement began in Sweden, and the crew included Scandinavian people from Norway, Sweden, Finland, and they were joined later by people from Spain, Italy, Greece, and myself. And we were sailing to Gaza in the hope of breaking the blockade, and also of bringing a message of hope to the people of Gaza, to tell them that they were not forgotten, and also a message to people in places like Canada to tell them that it's time to wake up, that they need to look at the situation and realize the inhumanity of the blockade. The blockade is slowly strangling the economy and the people of Gaza. A United Nations report from August of 2012 points out that by 2020, Gaza will be uninhabitable if present trends continue. At present, only 10% of the aquifer is drinkable, and by 2016, none of it will be drinkable because of infiltration of seawater. And once the Gaza aquifer is destroyed, it will take centuries to rebuild. They have not been able to rebuild sanitation facilities since the Operation Cast Lead, the bombing of Gaza by Israeli forces in 2008, 2009. There are dozens of schools that have not been rebuilt, and 85% of the schools have to operate on double shifts with large overpopulated classrooms. Many medicines are not available, and it's almost impossible for people to get into Israel for medical care. The gross domestic product of Gaza is only 61% of that of people on the West Bank, the occupied West Bank. And it's lower now than it was in the 1990s. So the people suffer from a stranglehold. And it's time that the people of the world realized that this is morally wrong, it's illegal. The Security Council has called for the siege of Gaza to be lifted, and I think it's time for the people of the world, the people of Canada, to demand that their governments should demand of Israel that the blockade should be lifted. The Canadian government claims to be a friend of Israel. Well, if the Canadian government is a friend of Israel, it should be prepared to speak the truth to Israel. I do not think that oppression and violence and robbing another people of their right to a decent life is the way to peace and security for any nation. It's certainly not the way for Israel. So if we want to be true friends to Israel, let us speak the truth. Let us demand that Israel live up to the highest codes of the Jewish people, which for centuries stood for justice rather than for oppression. And
but technically, what are you asking to the government, the Canadian government, to do?
We're asking the Canadian government to speak out, But even more than that, we are asking the Canadian people to demand of the Canadian government that they speak out. I don't think that this is going to happen simply by me asking, please, Mr. Harper, will you do something? You know, I think it's going to require the Canadian people to rise up and say, this is wrong. We do not want to tolerate it. We do not want to tolerate a government that will support this kind of oppression.
Okay, but when the Israeli authorities say there is no humanitarian crisis in Gaza, I guess you totally don't agree with that.
It's not that I don't agree with it, it's that the United Nations observers who know the situation on the ground don't agree with it and have documented the fact that there is a humanitarian crisis. And if, as Israel wants to disagree with the United Nations and with the observable facts, well, what can I do? But the United Nations has spoken, it's spoken time and again, and if Israel says that there's no humanitarian crisis, why do not they allow more free access for people to go in and report on the situation?
Can you maybe describe a little bit about what you experienced after the Israeli Navy boarded the vessel in the 72 hours after?
Well, the boarding of the vessel was an act of piracy. And, you know, this is symbolized by the fact that the Estelle was flying the Finnish flag, and they removed the Finnish flag and they ran up the Israeli flag. Now, pirates used to run up the skull and crossbones. Instead, we see the Israeli flag flying after an act of piracy. And I would think that this is something that would cause humanitarian Israeli people around the world a deep sense of shame to see their flag being flown as the symbol of piracy. And that, in fact, is what happened. 11 people were tasered, people who were unarmed, but who were not just bowing and saying, welcome, come on board, take over. They were resisting, but they were unarmed. It was a nonviolent resistance, but they were tasered, 11. And two of those people were senior citizens. I was not tasered, I was not harmed.
How was your detention?
Pardon?
How was the detention? How was it? Were you well treated? Were you...
The detention was not bad. You know, there were minor indignities, but the detention itself was not bad. That is not the story. The story is what is happening to the people of Gaza. And that's where the attention of the Canadian people has to be. Not on the minor inconveniences that I suffered for 3 days. You know, there are people who face detention for years. There are people who face interrogation that is brutal. There are people who face torture. I didn't have any of that difficulty. I had a fairly minor inconvenience in my life. So that isn't the story. The story is what happened to the people, what is happening to the people of Gaza. And also the story is the way in which the Israeli government thinks that it can violate international law and seize a ship in international waters.
Were you at this moment in international water? In international water or
Absolutely.
in Israel? Yeah.
We were on international waters. We were not even in the area that Israel claims for itself. We were in international waters.
Something that kind of confuses me is that there was some of the media coverage that suggested that you had to sign a deportation order, but at the same time you were arrested in international waters. Can you maybe?
It's rather funny because we were taken illegally into Israel. We were questioned, interrogated. I was interrogated by Mossad, as were the others, and then we were sent to a detention center, and we were sent this notice saying that we had entered Israel illegally. Well, I will agree with that. We had entered Israel illegally because we'd been brought there illegally by the Israeli Defense Forces. but we had not entered of our own voluntary free will. And so we refused to sign saying that we had entered illegally. They gave us another thing to sign, and we signed that with a statement that we had been taken in international waters and brought to Israel against our will.
Are you angry about what happened? Or how would you describe your emotions?
I'm angry at what is happening to the people of Gaza. I have grandchildren. I look at my grandchildren, I see them growing up, I see them having opportunities, I see their parents being able to give them a decent life. And I read about what's happening to the children of Gaza, and it's not happening to them. And there are many situations throughout the world where that is happening. I know that. Maybe some are much worse than that in Gaza. But the point is that we are complicit in the situation in Gaza, and we should speak out against it and demand that a so-called civilized nation like Israel will put an end to that occupation.
Are you in communication? There is a part of the Israeli public opinion that wants the peace. There is Israeli Jewish for peace, Israeli for peace, stuff like that. Are you in communication with those activists?
Well, we're in communication with the independent Jewish voices here in Canada, but there were 5 Jewish people on board the ship, aboard the Gaza. 3 of them were Israelis, and they were former members of the Israeli Defense Forces. And they, through their service with the Defense Forces, they had come to realize just how wrong the whole occupation was, and they wanted to see a different approach. And so they made a great contribution to our work. Everybody on board was committed to nonviolence, but we were also committed to putting an end to the blockade of Gaza.
What's next for you? What do you do next?
What next for me? Well, I'm going to go home. I'm going to have a glass of wine. I'm going to relax. But what's next for the people of Gaza? That's the question. We have to keep going back to that. And what's next for the people of Gaza is we have to bring them hope. We have to work to bring change. We have to work so that the next thing for the people of Gaza will be freedom and will be dignity. And I will continue to work for that, as will Eva, and as will the other activists that are gathered around me here today and throughout Canada and throughout the world. We're going to persist until things are changed.
Do you have any acknowledgement anywhere or that there is a security issue for Israel here? Or?
The security issue for Israel is becoming worse the more oppressive Israel becomes. I was amazed at the paranoia that existed in the Ben Gurion airport in Tel Aviv. They're paranoid in spite of the fact that they are the 4th largest military force in the world. They suffer from paranoia. They're afraid. And I think that fear is not the answer. Oppression and violence are not the answer. They do not bring peace and security. I think the majority of the people of Gaza and of the West Bank, the occupied West Bank, want peace. They do not want to be engaged in terrorism. They do not want to be engaged in a war with Israel. They want peace. They want to be able to live their lives with freedom and dignity, and they want to be able to live with their Israeli neighbors.